Okay, we are going to have a look at some fractions, decimals, percentages today, look at how they are linked, look at some of the questions around that. So question 1 is asking us to join a line to join fractions to percentages of the same value. 1 is done for us. We can notice from looking over here that we have 2 that we need to line up, and we've got 3 over here, which means obviously one of them is going to be wrong. What we need to do is we need to just use our knowledge here of fractions, decimals and percentages. We should know, and we should have a common fact, that 1/10 is 10%, okay, because 1 whole divided by 10 is going to be 10%, and that is going to work out for us that way. Now that leaves us with 25% and 4%. With this one here, 1/4, the difficult bit here is the fact that you've got a quarter and you've got 4% down here. So the most common mistake is to see the 4 and just to link that straight away with 4%. That's not how that works. A quarter is half of a half, okay? And if a half is 50%, that means a quarter is going to be half of 50%, which is 25%. Okay, so our quarter goes to 25%, and that means that 4% there we can completely ignore. Okay. Question number 2 is asking us to tick each of the cards that show more than a half. Okay, so things we need to know here for what a half is. A half as a fraction is a half as a decimal is 0.5, and a half as a percentage is 50%. Okay, so we're looking for ones over here which are greater than any of those. So if we think about this, if I converted a half into eighths, that would be 4/8, which means that this card is more than a half. 70% is greater than 50%, which is more than a half. 37% is less than 50%, which is less than a half. 0.34 is less than 0.5. Even though it has more digits in it, it's a smaller number, because 0.5 is 0 ones and 5 tenths. 0.34 is 0 ones and 3 tenths, and 3 tenths is less than 5 tenths, so it is less than a half. 3/6 actually is equivalent to 1/2. But the difficulty here is, or the tricky bit to remember here, is that we're looking for more than a half. So that one is a half, but it's not more than a half. And then here we have 0.55. Well, a half is 0.5, which is 0 ones and 5 tenths. Here we have 0 ones, 5 tenths, but also we have 5/100ths. And because of that, it means it's greater than 5 tenths by itself. So that means that this one here is greater than a half. And finally, we have 3/4. Now, a half is equal to 2/4, and 3/4 is greater than that. Question number 3. Hassan scores 40 out of 80 in a test. So I'm just going to write that down here. 40 out of 80 in a test. That's the fraction he scored. Kate scores 40% in the same test. Now here, I have 80 here. Now, there's a couple of ways that we know this. So who's got the higher score, Hassan or Kate? Hassan's going to have the highest score. Okay, 40 out of 80 is half, because I can simplify that down to 4/8, and I can simplify that down to 1/2. Okay, and we know that a half is 50%. That's one way we know that Hassan has scored more. Okay, the other way is to look at what Kate scores. Kate has scored 40% of 80. Okay, now I can work that out by working out that 10% of 80 is 8. Okay, and if she's got 40%, that means it's 4 times 8. So if she scored 40%, she's actually scored 32 marks. Okay, so there's 2 ways that you can qualify that. You can either state that Hassan has scored 50% in the test, and 50% is greater than 40%, or you can state that 40% of those 80 marks would actually be 32 marks, and 32 marks is less than the 40 marks that Hassan scored. Okay, so there's 2 different ways to explain that. Both of them are correct. Question number 4, we looked at these ones yesterday where we had a percentage or a decimal rather than converting it to a fraction. These are very similar. Okay, so 34%. This question here actually is very straightforward. Okay, it's an absolute gift of a question, number 4, because percentages are out of 100%. 100% is our whole. Okay, so if 100% is our whole, and I've got 34%, that means I've got 34 out of my 100%. So as a fraction, it is simply that. And this question here has asked it for that in that format. We haven't had to then do anything to that to convert that. Okay. Question number 5, similar, slightly trickier, but it's okay. So if I have a place value chart, if I just pop one in here quickly. If I have a place value chart and I have my ones, my tenths, and my hundredths here, and this is where I would put my decimal point. So here I have 0 ones, 0 tenths, and 2 hundredths. Okay, which means that if I'm going to write that out as a percentage, I've got 2 out of my 100. And actually percentages are already out of 100. So I have 2 hundredths, which means I have 2%. Question number 6 says, here is a grid made of squares. Shade in 10% of this grid. What we need to do is we need to count how many we've got here. I've got 6 and I've got 5. Okay, so I have an array of 6 by 5, which means I have a total of 30 squares. Okay. To shade in 10% of those 30 squares, I need to know what 10% of 30 is. To find 10% of anything, all I need to do is to divide the whole by 10. Okay, because the whole is 100%, and if I want to get from 100% to 10%, 100 divided by 10 is 10. So that means I need to do 30 divided by 10, which is going to give me an answer of 3. So you need to shade in 3 squares. It can be any 3 squares, it doesn't particularly matter. But now I've shaded in 3 of my 30, I've shaded in 10%. There we go.